I didn't do this earlier, so Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. That's a great place to start. All right, we're back once again. Good to see everybody, regulars and guests. So right to the topic at hand. As most people are aware, we've been working through the book of Galatians, right? That's what we've been doing these last few weeks. So the end of the year, I think when we started, very beginning of this year, whatever it was. So far, the reception's been pretty good. By that, I don't mean that I need people to approve a teaching or topic of study in order for it to be okay. But what I mean is that people have been hearing this and saying that this has either answered questions or that it's something that they have really needed to see addressed. And we've talked about that a little bit before and sort of how the Messianic movement in general has been handling Galatians. By and large, I think, poorly. But the common responses that we tend to see in this movement towards this book is either dismissing it, like, I don't really know what to do with it, or a really bad misunderstanding or misinterpretation of it. But to me, I've come to love Galatians. I see it more relevant now than perhaps I have in the past, perhaps even really in the history of, we could say church history, at least within the last few hundred years. And the reason I say I see it as more relevant now is because of how clear the warning is for those who have done what is currently being done in many Torah-keeping communities, which is trusting in yourself for your salvation, right? Trusting in your own law-keeping for your salvation. So remember what we've said every week, and I will continue to repeat these things. The Torah is wonderful and beautiful. That's why we devote a whole section of service to addressing each Torah portion every week. But the Torah was never meant to save you, and that's the key distinction. Now, I've also received a couple criticisms thus far, which I still appreciate, nonetheless. One criticism, which I wanted to sort of point out today, is regarding covenant. I keep saying that much of Galatians is not dealing with should you keep Torah or not. That's not even the issue that's being addressed. But it's about being in covenant. What is the entrance to the covenant? How do you become in covenant with God? But the criticism that I received was, how can I say that when the word covenant has yet to be addressed? Here we are halfway through Galatians 3, and we haven't even touched the word covenant, right? And that's a fair critique. Paul doesn't use some of the phrases that I've used. I've said entrance requirements, right? We talk about salvation, the entrance to the kingdom, entrance to the covenant. It's also true that we haven't yet encountered the word covenant, but I bring this up because we will be seeing it today, actually multiple times. So just remember that Paul is building his argument in multiple ways, and he reiterates his points multiple times with different terms. So bear with me for a bit, and we'll get there. Now, really quickly today, we're going to jump into the topic, but first I'm going to do a little bit of a recap. Now, you also may have noticed on the slide that it says verses 15 to 18. That is not a typo. We really are only getting through 4 verses today because there's that much to cover. We've been working through Galatians each week. The first week we did an introduction. The second week we did all of chapter 1. Chapter 2 was split into 2. Chapter 3 we started last week, so we will continue with it, but we really want to make sure that we're not missing something here. Now, I said last week I wasn't going to offer a recap because if we do that every single time, it's going to take way too much time to get through all of this. But I do want to throw one in today because we need to be able to summarize and re-examine what we've studied up to this point. Right? We need to be able to connect things from what we started in chapter 1 through 2 into 3 to see how everything fits together. I think this will also help us with what psychologists call consolidation, right? The retaining of information, committing what you've learned to memory. So to recap chapter 1, it's Paul's greeting. Right, he states the purpose for the letter, the occasion in which he's writing it. It's his introduction, and we don't know what preceded this entirely, right? Paul tells us some of the things he's addressing, but we don't know the reason that he actually sat down and wrote this letter. In that, did someone come to him and report what was happening in Galatia? Right? Did they send him a letter? Did he happen to see it and then leave and write a letter afterwards in response? We don't know a lot of what precipitated that. The interpreter's task of Galatians then is to reconstruct what was going on so that we can contextually understand what it is that Paul is addressing. For example, at first glance, simply reading Galatians 3, 10 to 12 can be quite overwhelming for Messianics. We touched on those passages last week. If you are of works, you're under the curse. The law is not of faith. Right? These are difficult things to grapple with. What does that mean? And how do you consistently uphold the Torah with such terminology? So that's why I say that Galatians has been largely ignored, or worse, people have tried to change the words of it. There's a pretty popular Bible version out there that has actually changed the words of Galatians to try to make it easier to understand, but in fact makes it say what it does not say. None of those solutions actually resolve things. None of those actually tell us how do we really understand Galatians. So again, to the review of chapter 1. The Galatians had been led astray by someone, and Paul doesn't name a name here. He doesn't even tell us specifically what group they're from. But someone has been teaching a perverted gospel. This is the first major point to key in on. That's what has prompted this letter more than anything else. This is how someone, and Paul doesn't, again, he doesn't say who, but they've come in and started teaching this distorted gospel. In chapter 1, verse 6, Paul says he is amazed, right? He is aghast. You could say flabbergasted if you like the modern English word. That so many Galatian believers have turned away towards a different gospel. He then clarifies and says, not that there is such a thing as another gospel, but you're being led astray by a distortion of the gospel of Messiah. Regarding this first point, then, we need to make sure we understand what the gospel is and what it is not. As we've said before, the gospel is not pray this prayer so you can go to heaven when you die. That's not the biblical idea of the gospel. Gospel means good news. And that good news is not to float up to heaven and be with Jesus forever. That gets into a different topic for another time. But the gospel, the good news as it relates to the kingdom, is about God's kingdom, establishing his kingdom. And as we learn from the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The ultimate hope we have is not to leave here and go dwell in some space-like dimension. It's that the kingdom of heaven comes to earth. That has always been the plan. In creation, in the garden, we have convergence. N.T. Wright uses that term. I like that. Convergence. Right? Heaven and earth together. God himself walked in the garden, according to Genesis 3:8. God walked with man in the garden. After the fall, the ability to be in God's presence was lost, or at the very least limited. And Aaron touched on that, about holiness, because we lost that pure status that we started out with as humanity. That was the purpose of the temple, to provide a space where heaven and earth could once again converge, where God and man could commune. That was the point of the tabernacle. That was the point of the temple. And for a time, that happened. The Spirit of God rested over the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle. And when Solomon finished and dedicated the temple, the same goes for it. And so God would dwell among humanity again. But then the Spirit of Adonai left the temple, and it was destroyed. Ezekiel specifically has a vision of this. The Spirit of God he saw pulled and withdrawn out from the temple, and then exile. And even with the return from exile, things were never entirely what they had previously been, until, of course, that young woman gave birth in Bethlehem. Yeshua is the ultimate definition and sense of this convergence, this heaven and earth together. When he taught, he often referred to the gospel of the kingdom, right? The good news of the kingdom. And this good news didn't simply start being taught when Yeshua came onto the scene. We could say it started in the garden. It was reiterated to Noah and Abraham and Moses and all of Israel. But the language that we see the apostles most often using is from Isaiah. Isaiah is by far the most oft quoted of all the prophets in the New Testament. Isaiah contains the message of salvation arguably more than the other prophets, at least explicitly. Isaiah speaks of the good news. He speaks of setting captives free, the coming servant, the restoration of the kingdom, the rebuilding of Zion. The good news is not about going to heaven. It is about God's kingdom being established on earth. Now you might wonder, why do we have this rabbit trail and what does it have to do with Galatians? Right? It's a fair question. So we put it back into perspective. The gospel of the kingdom has parameters. Right? Jews from the first century, they knew the gospel. They knew about the coming salvation of Israel. Many, however, did not understand the correct mechanism through which the gospel would work. While they knew it was about the kingdom and freedom from exile, they had built a system that misunderstood what the core of the gospel would be. And Paul is clear on what that is. It is faith, or I prefer the word allegiance, and that to the king. Some others, however, had been teaching that the entrance to the kingdom was predicated on one's ethnic Jewish identity. Paul is adamant that that is not the case. So in Galatians, Paul's concern, and we see this fleshed out in the second half of the letter especially, is that someone was bringing a perverted gospel message. Someone was proclaiming that the means by which one would be saved, would be a member of God's kingdom, was by some means other than through faith, through allegiance to the king. So once again, the chief concern of Galatians is a distorted sense of what gets me into covenant with God. Another thing we can glean from Paul's writing is that the opposition was not only teaching a false gospel, but they were also teaching against Paul. He takes it upon himself to defend himself, likely against lashon hara, or slanderous speech, multiple times. He defends his mission. He defends his calling to be an apostle. He defends the gospel, not a gospel, the gospel. And he uses past encounters with those in Jerusalem to back up his claims. He talks about meeting with the leaders in Jerusalem and how they added nothing to his message. His gospel message was already complete. Chapter 2 largely contains more of that, along with his encounter with Peter. So let's recap that for a moment. Peter's major flaw here was his hypocrisy regarding non-Jews. The very issue God himself addressed with Peter in Acts, where he gave Peter a vision to show him that Peter should not declare the non-Jews to be common or profane on account of their ethnicity. Rather, that God had extended the call of the gospel to Jew and Gentile, and they were invited to be saved, to be part of God's people the same way as Jews. Now, Peter knew this, right? Again, Acts 10. We could go there and read it. Peter knew this to be the case, and yet apparently at some point, according to Paul in Galatians 2, he turned away from eating and fellowshipping with Gentiles once again out of fear of the Jewish believers that came down from Jerusalem. This, Paul calls hypocrisy. And the reason it is so dangerous is because it served to reinforce those same ethnic boundaries, the same idea. And imagine being one of those affected, right? If Peter won't eat with us because we're Gentiles and not Jews or even converts, then we must not be acceptable into God's kingdom. This encounter is entirely relevant to Galatians because it touches on the very same issue. Can an ethnic non-Jew be accepted into the covenant of God without converting, without becoming a Jew, or as we commonly say, without being a proselyte? Paul and Peter, by virtue of his vision in Acts 10, they already knew the answer to be yes. Absolutely. So in chapter 1, Paul tells the Galatians they are being led astray by a false gospel, a false means of covenant acceptance and kingdom entrance, again, if we can use such terms. In chapter 2, he uses the example of Peter so as to reinforce his message that Jews and Gentiles are saved in the same way. In chapter 3, we got into a deeper part of the argument, and we're still working through chapter 3 now. As we saw last week, Paul here unveils what the distorted gospel that he is so adamantly opposing is predicated on, namely some sort of works of law. This brings us to what we looked at once again last week, and we'll be continuing with in a moment. Chapter 3 has Paul coming from primarily two different angles. Right, first, in verses 1 through 5, he appeals to their own experiences in the Ruach. They should already know that the gospel that they received is true, because it is through the gospel that they received the Ruach to begin with. Paul reminds them of the miraculous works that were being done and how they already received the Spirit. How could you turn away from the true gospel when you already received the Spirit? In verses 6 to 14, he moves away from an appeal to their experience, and he begins to build another argument on an appeal to Scripture, citing specifically the example of Abraham. And Abraham is the perfect example for multiple reasons. First, Abraham received the gospel. Paul says that in 3:8. The gospel was preached to Abraham. That gospel was not predicated on any system of works or conversion. Okay? That system was predicated on God choosing to bless through Abraham because Abraham trusted God. Paul says that those who, like Abraham, trust God, are considered the children of Abraham. Now, this is important. The language here is important because child of Abraham, you can put that in air quotes, child of Abraham was a reference to those in covenant with God. We find this in Acts 13:26, but also the same phrase in some apocryphal writings like 4th Maccabees, where children of Abraham is a reference directly to Israelites, to people in covenant with God. So when Paul says that those who are of faith are children of Abraham, he is making a direct reference to who is or is not considered Israel. And to Paul, it is those who trust God. Paul continues in chapter 3 by quoting the Tanakh in multiple places to reinforce his point. He sets a dichotomy here, but not what is commonly preached. Indeed, the common interpretation is that Paul was teaching that faith is the opposition of works or law-keeping. Just as Abraham had faith before the Torah was given at Sinai, so too Paul says that faith is contrary to law-keeping. Or at least that's how it's commonly been understood. But that is not, in fact, the contrast that he's making. At no point does he contrast trusting in God with keeping the Torah, because that would be silly, wouldn't it? Rather, he is contrasting those who trust in God for salvation with those who trust in themselves, in their own law-keeping for salvation. You see the difference? You can have trust in God and keep the law. So let's reread verses 10 to 14 again. And from there is where we'll jump off into today's verses. Galatians 3:10, "For all who rely on the deeds of Torah are under a curse. For the scriptures say, 'Cursed is everyone who does not keep doing everything written in the scroll of the Torah.' It is clear that no one is set right before God by Torah, for the righteous shall live by emunah, or faith. However, Torah is not based on trust and faithfulness. On the contrary, the one who does these things shall live by them. Messiah liberated us from the Torah's curse, having become a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree,' in order that through Messiah Yeshua the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so we might receive the promise of the Ruach through trusting faith." Now, verse 10, "All who rely on deeds of Torah," the Tree of Life version says. The New American Standard here reads, "All who are of works of the law." Once again, Paul's contrast here is those who are of works with those who are of faith. Okay? The implication being, if you are of faith, then you are trusting in God. If you are of works, you are trusting in yourself. That's the key distinction. And he never, at any point, says that those who are of faith do not have works. That kind of gets into James's message, but that's for another time. In verse 11, he says, "The righteous shall live by emunah," or faith. The Tree of Life usually prefers trust here. This, Paul takes as a statement about justification, the status of being declared right with God. This comes by faith, not by Torah, which shouldn't offend anyone, because the Torah was never meant to be that which declared you right in standing before God anyway. That wasn't the point of it. In verse 12, now I don't like the word "however" here. You see in verse 12, it says, "However, Torah is not based." Right? It sounds like it denotes something that is the opposite end of the spectrum. When you say "however," you mean something in contrast or in opposition to what you've just stated. The ESV and New Revised Standard also render this as "but" here. But the law is not. So, but the law is not based on faith. The issue here is that Paul is not in fact diverging from his point. In verse 11, he says, "It is clear that no one is declared right by the law." In verse 12, he is not going to say something contrary to that, but rather he's going to expound on it again. The conjunction present here in Greek is usually taken as a contrastive, which means it's in contrast, right? But, however. I said one thing, however, now I'm saying something else. And that is, the translators, I assume, due to context, providing a contrast between these two verses. But I don't think it should read that way. This same conjunction could just as easily be rendered as a connective conjunction, meaning and, or somewhat in addition to. And I would argue, given the context and the content, it should be, as verse 12 is still Paul arguing the negative case. That is, what doesn't result in justification. So this would have verses 11 and 12 rendered this way. "It is clear that no one is set right before God by Torah, for the righteous shall live by emunah. And Torah is not based on trust and faithfulness. On the contrary, the one who does these things shall live by them." The difference is subtle, but we can see this way the point he makes in 11 is reinforced in 12. The law doesn't justify you, and again, it wasn't supposed to. And that is, the law is not the thing which determines your entrance into the kingdom, into the covenant of God. So what then is it for? We'll ask this question today. We'll also readdress it next week. It is the guidelines for those that are already in covenant, as we're going to continue to see here in just a few moments. The quote from Leviticus 18:5, right, which is at the end of this here, "Those who do these things shall live by them." The quote here regards those already in covenant. And as such, it means that law-keeping cannot be the entry requirement to the covenant if the means of getting into the covenant is other than law-keeping. Now again, I know I said all this last week, but I want to make sure that we connect last week to this week. Verse 13, Messiah liberated us from the Torah's curse, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So from what then did Messiah Yeshua free us? It is not the obligation for those in covenant to keep Torah. That's the most common interpretation. He freed us from the requirement to keep the Mosaic law. That's not the curse of the Torah. Rather, it is the curse of the Torah that brings about penalty for sin. The penalty for sin is death. And the curse of the law is death for sin. Sin and death is what we have been freed from, the curse that the law brings. Verse 14, in order that through Messiah Yeshua the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so we might receive the promise of the Ruach through trusting faith. Here, Paul circles back to Abraham's example. Abraham trusted God, and those who trust God are Abraham's children. The gospel was to be extended to all nations of the earth so that the promise of God to bless all the nations would be fulfilled. Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection accomplished this, which brings us to the end of our rather long-winded recap. So now we can enter verse 15. Everybody ready? Starting at verse 15, he says, brothers and sisters, I speak in human terms. Even with a man's covenant, once it has been confirmed, no one cancels it or adds to it. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. It doesn't say, and to seeds, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is the Messiah. What I am saying is this, Torah, which came 430 years later, does not cancel the covenant previously confirmed by God so as to make the promise ineffective. For if the inheritance is based on law, it is no longer based on a promise, but God has graciously given it to Abraham by means of a promise. Now, Paul speaks in verse 15 of covenant, right? I said we'd get to that today. Paul is now speaking directly of covenant. When did this transition take place? At what verse did he switch, saying, here's what I was talking about. I was talking about law keeping. Now I'm going to talk about covenant. Well, again, in Paul's theology, covenant is tied with salvation. Covenant is tied with the gospel. Covenant is tied with kingdom. So really, he's been talking about the covenant this entire time. He says, even in human terms, covenants between people are set and sealed. You can't go back later and decide to add to a pre-existing covenant. And see, this is where it gets tricky, right? Because there are so many covenants in the Tanakh. We have the Noachic covenant, right? God will not flood the earth again. We have the Abrahamic covenant. We have the Mosaic, or I prefer to say the Sinaitic covenant. We have the Aaronic, Aaronic, right, with Aaron. We have the Davidic. We have the prophetic promises of a pending new covenant in the Tanakh. There are multiple covenants to speak of. Another thing we have to understand is that a new covenant does not invalidate a prior covenant. And Paul says exactly that in verse 17. Covenants can be small and constrained, or they can be broad and large. The Davidic covenant, for example, was exclusive. It was for the descendants of David, not for every Israelite, not for every Jew, for the descendants of David. The same goes for the Aaronic covenant. It's for the descendants of Aaron, not for every Levite, not for every Israelite, for the descendants of Aaron. But the Noachic covenant was universal. God made it with Noah and all his descendants, which by extension is the whole population of the earth, right? As well as all living creatures on the ark. But note that the Davidic covenant did not replace or nullify the Noachic covenant, right? When there was a new one issued, it didn't replace the previous one. It didn't nullify the one that already stood. Nor did the covenant at Sinai replace the Abrahamic covenant. That would defy the very nature of a covenant being something that is not canceled or nullified. So just as much as we love to say that the new covenant does not replace the Sinaitic, we have to recognize the example Paul is using, which brings us to verse 16. Now there's an interesting debate that centers on this passage here. In Greek, the word that the Tree of Life version translates as covenant here is diatheke. Diatheke. This word is found in the Septuagint for the Hebrew Brit, or covenant. Pretty simple. However, this Greek word actually has a whole lot of meaning aside from just that, right? It means will, or really last will and testament. And in fact, some translations have testament here. So then we have to decide, which way is Paul using the term, since in his own letters he uses it both ways. In verses 15 to 17, we find additional Greek legal terminology. It does not fit within the understanding of this word in the covenant sense, but rather it suits the last will and testament sense. We also see Paul use this in the verse that follows in reference to inheritance. which again, inheritance is inextricably tied to a last will and testament. He even prefaces his usage here with saying that he is using a human analogy. And I think that's key here in verse 15. I think Paul is using the word to refer to the concept of a last will and testament and the inheritance that follows after it. However, no doubt Paul's Jewish education and his way of thinking would have covenant right at the front of his mind while writing this. So perhaps, I'm going to propose something crazy here, what if Paul is intentionally using the word in both ways? He clearly has the idea of inheritance in mind. It's here in the passage. It fits the Greek legal system and the language that he uses here to describe it. It also suits his non-Jewish audience. But given the broader context of Abraham and the covenant, especially as he's about to go deeper into in this very chapter, we cannot ignore the relation to covenant. So in my view, this is not either or. It is both and. In verse 16, Paul isn't talking about the covenant at Sinai being replaced by the new covenant. And that tends to be the thing everybody wants to debate. He's talking about the covenant with Abraham not being replaced or nullified by the covenant at Sinai. Again, we have to relate this language to the language of inheritance. He means that the covenant at Sinai does not undo the promised inheritance to the seed of Abraham. He also makes note of the language used in Genesis 15:5, which is singular. It says, "He took him outside and said, 'Look up now at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your seed be.'" The word seed here, zerah, is singular in this passage. While this is not an outstanding grammatical point, as the word is often singular, right? It's like a collective singular. Paul picks up on it and says this seed refers to one. This is more of that legal language I mentioned. Not so much the words he uses, but his arguments. It sounds kind of like a loophole, doesn't it? And actually it does, especially in the first century. Well, that word is singular, not plural, and therefore, see what I mean? We find the rabbis in the Talmud often do this very same thing. They key in on the specific grammatical form of a word as it appears in Scripture and build a case on top of it. An example of this is from Tractate Sanhedrin 4:5, where it's argued that the Hebrew for blood, in reference to Cain killing Abel and his blood crying out, is plural, and it is. So your brother's bloods cries out. The rabbis argued this is because it is a reference not only to Abel's blood, but also that of his descendants that would now never come into existence because he had been killed. So it's an interesting note, but back to verse 16. He says, "Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed." It doesn't say, "and to seeds," as of many, but as of one, "and to your seed, who is the Messiah." So Yeshua is the promised seed and the means through which the promise is fulfilled. Trust in God, not trust in one's Torah keeping, is the basis of the Abrahamic covenant, the invitation and entrance even of non-Jews, as all nations would be blessed through Abraham. This is the basis of the covenant Paul speaks of here. It is possible, though we can't be certain, that the opponents of Paul here in Galatia were placing an emphasis on Isaac. Right? It's not an unheard of argument or interpretation at this time that the singular seed refers to Isaac and thereby excludes non-Israelites. Paul then comes back and clarifies, no, this isn't a reference to Isaac, right? And thereby only ethnic Israel. It's a reference to Yeshua. And we'll touch back on this argument when we get to the latter half of chapter 4. Verse 17, he says, "What I am saying is this. Torah, which came 430 years later, does not cancel the covenant previously confirmed by God so as to make the promise ineffective." Once again, here we have this rich usage of diatheke, or covenant, right? And I believe Paul fully intends now to relate it to the covenant of Abraham at this point. And what does he say? The Torah being given 430 years after the promise to Abraham does not nullify that promise. Nor does the concept of law-keeping replace the covenant that is based on faith and the invitation of that covenant to all nations. Further, as Paul has argued in this entire letter, the covenant with Abraham had a guarantee. Being declared right with God, the churchy term is normally justification, comes on the basis of faith. Or again, I prefer loyalty or allegiance. It comes on the basis of faith, not on the basis of one's own law-keeping. As such, since the covenant cannot be replaced or canceled by the next covenant that comes along, so too the means of salvation and being declared right cannot be replaced. What it was with Abraham, it is still at Sinai. Simply put, even once the Torah was given, the means of salvation did not change, and those means are still the same today. There was no Jews were saved by law keeping, but believers today are saved by faith. It's always been faith. I would like to add here that Paul knew Abraham was obedient. So before we get any of that, you're being kind of too hard on the Torah. That doesn't sound very messianic of you. Lest anyone accuse me of any such thing, let's go ahead and get that out of the way. We can argue which laws predated Sinai all day, but the implication is clear that whatever instruction, or Torah, Abraham had been taught, he obeyed it. Genesis 26, 4-5, I will multiply your seed like the stars of the sky, and I will give your seed all these lands, and in your seed all nations of the earth will continually be blessed. There's the reiteration of the promise of the covenant. In verse 5, because Abraham listened to my voice and kept my charge, my mitzvot, my decrees, and my instructions. Abraham obeyed God's voice, his charge, his mitzvot or commandments, his decrees, and his Torot. Right, this is the plural form of Torah, his laws or instructions. Clearly, there is something to be said of the commandments and laws that Abraham kept even prior to the giving of the Torah at Sinai. But we don't have an exhaustive list of what those were. Abraham didn't build the tabernacle. Abraham didn't carry around the Ark of the Covenant. He didn't go up to Jerusalem for Passover in commemoration of the Exodus, which had not yet taken place. More on that in a moment. But for now, verse 18 of Galatians 3. For if the inheritance is based on law, it is no longer based on a promise, but God has graciously given it to Abraham by means of a promise. Once again, the inheritance of the promise, the gospel, the kingdom, the covenant, is not based on Torah. It is not based on one's own works and law-keeping. It is based on the promise to Abraham. And Abraham is the model of the covenant, a model of being declared right with God through faith. But the two covenants are in accord, and that's by design. The Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant with the Torah became the vessel through which the Abrahamic covenant would find its fullness. After all, it is through the tribes of Israel that Messiah came. I think Michael Heiser posited that the Torah was necessary for setting Israel apart, since the promised Messiah would come from Israel. So the Torah did part of its job in preserving a remnant of the people to prepare the way for Yeshua. Now, so closely do these two covenants accord when kept in proper order, as we've been saying, that the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, circumcision, became the primary identifier of one's allegiance to the Mosaic covenant by the time of the first century. Now, once again, I say this is not about Torah versus faith. This is about the order of things. Abraham was declared right by his faith. Abraham was covenanted before Sinai, and before even he himself was circumcised. But here's where we have to come to a point that is likely going to be contentious among Messianics, to say the least. It is a common belief among Messianic groups that, and it's very largely because of a strong belief in Judaism, that the Torah is eternal. Now, when we say eternal, we don't mean the same as everlasting. I like to make that distinction. Everlasting is, here it is, and it never ends. Eternal is, it's outside of time. It had no beginning. It has no end. Right? Very similar to this in a lot of Hebrew root circles. It's this idea that equates Yeshua with the Torah. Right? It goes something like this. We start at John 14:6. Yeshua said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Okay. Yeshua is the way, the truth, and the life. No dispute. Then we go to Psalm 119, verse 142. Your justice is righteousness forever, and your Torah is truth. Again, no argument. The Torah is truth. Yeshua is the truth. Therefore, Yeshua is the Torah. It sounds so revelatory to people new to this walk. It sounds biblical, right? We just quoted the Bible to get there. But there's a couple issues here. First, it's a non sequitur. It does not follow. Okay? Yeshua is the Word, John 1:1 says. In Greek, that's the Logos. He doesn't say he's the Nomos. He doesn't say that he's the law. He says he's the Word. And there's a whole theology behind Yeshua being the Word. There's so much more packed into him being the Word than just law. Okay, second is that Yeshua is divine. Let's be clear on that one. If the Torah is God's instructions, and make no mistake, it is, then by definition, God is more than his own instructions. God is more than the Torah. Yeshua is more than the Torah. And as we've said since the first week of this series, the Torah is not your Savior. The two cannot be completely equated, because to do so is to reduce and minimize the glory and holiness of God and the work of Yeshua. But more than that, we have to, again, recognize what Torah is and is not. Torah, and in here I mean the Torah proper, right, the first 5 books of the Bible, does not define the perfect scenario. Again, this gets contentious. Bear with me. It doesn't. Okay, so stop and think for a minute. In the garden, there were instructions, right? Man has always had, from his creation, man has always had instructions, always had something, do this, don't do this. In the garden, it was, don't eat that fruit, do go be fruitful and multiply. And you could say also till the land and all that, because, man was created to work. Okay, there was a do, there was a do not. Man has always had instructions. In the garden, humanity, man and woman equally were given dominion, were told to rule and to serve. They were told to be fruitful and multiply. That is Torah with a lowercase t. That is instruction straight from the mouth of God. Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That, too, was Torah. It was instruction. But Adam and Eve were not commanded not to commit murder in the garden, were they? Not to commit adultery. You could argue being the only humans, it wasn't an option anyway. They weren't commanded to slaughter animals, to build a curtain for God to hide his presence behind like the tabernacle. Why? Because the garden was the ideal. That was what creation was intended to be. A creation where God would come to be with his heavenly family. Again, we have the Divine Council series on YouTube. It touches on more of that. But after the fall, many things occurred that were not optimal. They were not the ideal. The tabernacle was a means of making up for man's failure. It was not the ideal. The temple was not the ideal. Those were brought into the picture to mitigate the problem. Now enter the Torah. The Torah was given, why? To mitigate. The Torah does not prescribe the perfect and ideal. It restrains wickedness. That's the point. In the fallen world, the Torah serves to tell us how to live set apart. And Aaron touched on that a lot earlier, talking specifically from this week's Torah portion, as this week's Torah portion actually touches on the giving of the 10 Commandments, right? In the fallen world, the Torah tells us how to live set apart, how to be God's people, not in the perfect way, but in the midst of a fallen world. That's why there's so many laws about sacrifices. You don't need a sacrifice if you're perfect. But the Torah contains many passages about sacrifices. You don't need passages about ritual cleanliness and sacred space and encroachment if you're always set apart, always holy, and always clean. But the Torah does contain many such regulations. Now, the Torah also contains things that are the ideal, right? Love is the easiest one. Love God, love your neighbor. That's Torah. Laws about worshiping him, laws about serving him and caring for others. Now today we look at laws about slavery or polygamy, and we don't really know what to do with them. Well, they're in there. What do we do with it? But again, they're not describing the perfect ideal. They are mitigating from within an ancient Near Eastern framework the wickedness of man. So why then do we say all this? Because in this passage here, Galatians 3:17 says what I just said. The Torah came 430 years after Abraham. You could also take the example of Jacob. The Torah says not to marry a woman and her sister, as they would be rivals. Yet Jacob did this. Bickering and strife in one's household has always been contrary to God's nature. The Torah was given to be the guide to those in covenant. Once again, this is about order and priority. This is not, we have faith versus Torah. This is about the order of what comes first. We, human beings, are finite. Abraham was brought into covenant before the very sign of the covenant. He was covenanted before he was circumcised. Abraham then, as we should expect, and what did we just read? He obeyed the laws and instructions of God. That's why he's Paul's perfect example. Perfect example, not that he's perfect. Torah tells us how to live in part, but also to understand sin. Paul speaks about this a lot in Romans, about how the Torah brings about knowledge of sin. He uses the example of coveting, right? That he would not have known not to covet, except that the Torah commanded it not be done. And coveting is a special commandment because it is purely mental, right? Coveting is a state of mind, or really we could say it's a state of the heart. As Hebraically, it's the same thing. The point of showing us our sin, which the law should be doing, right, is to show us our need for redemption, our need of a Savior. Torah is not the Savior. Torah is that which should show us our need of a Savior. As Paul will also argue here in Galatians, which we'll see in a week or two, the Torah was supposed to be our guardian to make sure that we arrived at Messiah. This doesn't mean there was no Torah. and that God had no commandments or statutes or laws. He did. But the formal giving of the whole Torah from Sinai, that event had not yet occurred at the time of Abraham. Now, if you're listening and you don't like the sound of this, let me offer you a preview of next week. Galatians 3:19, then why the Torah? It was added because of wrongdoings until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. It was arranged through angels by the hand of an intermediary. Paul answers the hypothetical question his detractors no doubt had in mind. If the Torah doesn't define one's entrance to the covenant, then why was it given? But now I'm getting ahead of myself, so you'll have to tune in next week. We're just about done here. We'll wrap up this portion today. Once again, I know we only got through just a few verses. But I want to make sure that we spend enough time working through the material. If we needed to go through it one verse per week, we can do that. If that's what it took to make sure that people can actually grow and become comfortable with Galatians. I would love to see that as a result of this, right? That everybody can actually come to Galatians and say, oh, I love this book because it helps me keep things in the right order. Not, I don't know what to do with that because I've been told it means I don't have to keep Torah. That's what the response should be. Now, having only covered just a few verses today, I really only have one, shall we say, word of practical application. One thing to really focus on. As we said from the introduction and each week, we don't want to just mentally deal with Galatians. We don't want to read and study through Scripture only to add to how much we know. Because at the end of the day, our knowledge alone doesn't do anything. It is our behavior, it is our lifestyle, it is our heart that should be getting conformed to the image of the Son. So what I want to start with here is actually not from Galatians, but we'll relate it back to it in just a second. What I want to start with is actually 2 Corinthians 13:5. He says, test yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Examine yourselves, or don't you know yourselves that Messiah Yeshua is in you, unless, of course, you failed the test. With all the talk the last few weeks about priority and precedent, hey, maybe that's what I should have named this series, Priority and Precedent. Anyway, with all the talk about priority and precedent, I hope it's becoming clear that the core message we're getting from Galatians is not faith versus Torah. Right? It's not that message which is so commonly believed. Rather, it is faith first and Torah keeping afterwards. On the basis of Abraham, what was Abraham's example? Faith first and then his Torah keeping. A godly walk should be filled with good fruit. Now I read 2 Corinthians 13:5 here because it makes the point I want to bring home. Test yourselves, examine yourselves, ask God to search you and try you, like David did in the Psalms. Because I'll be honest with y'all, it greatly concerns me to see so many people putting their trust in their own work over Messiah. I've seen this countless times. There are entire congregations built around an identity, a shared sense of Torah observance as what defines them over and above a shared faithfulness to the Messiah. Things have gotten out of balance. They have jumbled their priorities. So this week, I would implore you, especially in your prayer time, examine yourself. Ask God to reveal it to you. Is your trust, the core of your faith, your loyalty, truly to Messiah Yeshua above all else? Or did you just add the theological visage of Yeshua into your core law-keeping identity? It's not an accusation. It's more of a rhetorical question. Once again, folks, this isn't one versus the other. It is both. It needs to be both, but it must be in the right order. Amen?